The title of the second panel today is Druze Resistance, Assimilation, Occupation, and the Land. And our speaker today is a familiar face. Dr. Lindsey Pullum was the ADF Fellow in 2021-2022. Dr. Pullum is a cultural anthropologist who specializes in cultural expressions of ethnic, religious differences in Middle Eastern popular culture. She writes on Palestinians and Druze experience within Israel popular culture, and today her paper entitled The Golan Heights and an Adopted Land, ? The floor is yours. Please welcome Dr. Pullum.
Good morning. Like Binan said, my name is Dr. Lindsey Pullum. My talk is on the Golan Heights, which, is anyone nervous for this talk? I know I am. Good, shared experience on this left side. After a lunch of ful and pita, Sami and I drive to the farthest border in Mesd Shams. Sami, originally born in Lebanon, immigrated to Israel during the 80s as a child to escape the brutality of the Lebanese civil war. And I met Sami by chance at a Lebanese restaurant in the Druze village of Masada in the Golan Heights, and I was explaining my interest to the business owner, and he's like super into it. He overhears what I'm saying, and he volunteers to take me to show me real Druze life in the Golan. And what I didn't know is that he meant to send me to the ceasefire line that separates the most eastern edge of Mesd Shams from a Syrian outpost. A lot of us know this as like the shouting hill, where you can shout to your neighbors, you can hear them back and exchange news. And so we pull up to this barbed wire fence, and a small group of people are next to us taking their turn, listening to the explanation from a tour guide about this fence that they are seeing in the shouting hill. And it seems the others had the same idea, to come face to face with the ceasefire line, or more accurately, the Daesh fighters on the other side who had overtaken that outpost. And this is 2017, 2018. And I'm standing there pretty nervous because I've never been to Mesd Shams. I've never gotten into a stranger's car and driven to the edge of a land. And I don't really know what to expect. And as we're waiting for this passenger van to leave with these tour guides and their tourists, Sami turns and says, because we're hearing like pops in the background, and I'm asking, like, how long are we going to be here? And he doesn't answer. And he says, after hearing the sounds of mortar shells in the background, he says, you hear? You hear that? That's Daesh. And he's smiling, and he's excited, and he's extending his hand to gesture to this beautiful view of the Syrian civil war on the other side. And he's giving this huge impression of pride and amusement as he drags me closer to the fence. But Sami considered this was an important feature for me to see as part of the Golan Heights. And this story of tourism and misadventure in the Golan describes a season of fieldwork I conducted in 2018. I was living in Katzrin, which is the largest Jewish settlement in the Golan, and I was volunteering at a youth hostel as a way to access research sites in Syrian Druze villages. So for those of you who don't know, if you're getting certain funding from a government or from a university, there are stipulations of where you can and can't go with public money. And so volunteering in a Jewish settlement under occupation was the only way to access interviews with people living in occupation. Like that duality, that like hypocrisy almost, is very, very real for those of us who are using funding to do this research. But by inserting myself into the tourism industry in the Golan, I'm uncovering all of these ways that Israeli colonialism is shaping the geography, the economy, and the human rights of Golan Druze refugees. The annexation and control of the Golan following the Six-Day War of 1967 remains a contentious issue. With no established borders and UN peacekeepers roaming about, the area feels settled and unsettled. Jewish kibbutzim, or these communal, non-competitive spaces, and moshavim, which are cooperative agricultural communities, they continue to settle the volcanic terrain, while Syrian Druze refugees and their forms of citizenship and status of residential life just remain respectively undecided and precarious. Increased volatility following the Syrian civil war and instability from the Syrian government has eroded previous forms of intersectionality for Druze refugees who either identify as Syrian or of Syrian heritage. Meanwhile, the fascination with and the fascinating beauty of the Golan has increased tourism ventures for Israelis and non-Israelis, as well as opportunities for employment for Syrian Druze. You can visit an old bunker. You can go to an abandoned military base, reimagining its past use. You can sit on the ridgeline at sunset, listening for sounds of mortar shells or IDF tanks in the back. You can sip local wine. You can eat local goat cheese. You can hike the forest. You can swim in the waterfalls. All of this created space makes the Golan incredibly beautiful and incredibly rich for experiences. All while the Syrian Druze villages remain there under Israeli control. Masdar Shams, Masada, Bukata, and Ain Kinya. So after nearly 60 years, Syrian Druze living in the Golan Heights are more familiar with life in Israel than their ancestral life in Syria. In fact, the majority of Golani residents are in their 50s and have only lived under Israeli rule. So after 2012, more Druze applied for Israeli citizenship than ever before, gaining their right to vote in Israeli elections. Golani Druze are trilingual in Arabic, Hebrew, and English, often being educated in Israeli and previously Syrian universities. But these markers of Israeli life, I mean, this really literally is a recent development for Syrian Druze living in the Golan. And so my question for you today, and the one I'll hopefully answer, is in what ways have Israeli practices and policies regarding the Golan Heights made Israeli life the only real choice for Druze refugees still living there? So I'm going to talk about the practice and economics of cultural tourism to the region, specifically on nature and hiking. Although, to be honest, when I was making my talk, I wanted to tell you more about wine tastings and goat cheese and sounds of military tourism and dark tourism that face the Syrian, the ceasefire line. So I'm going to argue that the policies that encourage various forms of tourism have encouraged an adoptive life. Careers facilitating tourism and tourist remediation of tourist experiences erase indigenous forms of resistance. And yet contemporary integration differs starkly from the integration of Druze currently living in Israel, in the Galilee, and in Mount Carmel, but does create a new voice for Arab-Israeli rights. Okay, so before going too far into the examples, I want to give you, this is our space, this is what we're looking at. We're in northern Israel. This map in particular, I want you to take note of, where you've got your Druze Syrian villages at the very, very top, and then you have an increasing number of Israeli settlements going from the Sea of Galilee all the way up. I will wait for her photo. Did you get it? Yeah, awesome. So brief timeline, or some facts to just give you context. So you have 105,000, yes, that's right. 105,000 Syrians flee the Golan during the Six-Day War, and only 5 villages remain, 4 Druze and 1 Alawite village, with Masdar Shams being the largest. And then you have 23 to 25,000 Druze that are permanent residents of Israel with undefined nationality. So they don't necessarily have Israeli citizenship. They don't necessarily have a nationality as far as the Israeli government is concerned, but they do have permanent residency cards similar to those of living in East Jerusalem. So in 1981, the Golan is annexed, subject to Israeli law. By 82, the Golani Druze have been offered and rejected Israeli citizenship. By 2017, Netanyahu has said the Golan is Israel's. And 2019, President Donald Trump agrees and says, yes, the US recognizes the Golan Heights as Israeli territory. I think I mentioned this earlier, but I'll just reiterate, the majority of residents are less than 52 years old and have only lived under Israeli law. And then after 2012, that number for applying for Israeli citizenship was going annually from 5 people to nearly 200 people. So we're seeing a huge jump in applications for citizenship. And so I know at least some of us are very aware of the narratives around Syrian Druze being undeniably loyal to Syria, making them different from Israeli Druze, who are loyal to Israel. And that's been true till very recently, because of negotiations between Israel and Syria with the return of the Golan to Syria. And a lot of people have intense loyalties to Syria to protect themselves and their family from government, and I will add, most seriously, from social retribution that comes from denying Syrian heritage. So as I'm living in the Golan in 2018, I'm becoming immensely familiar with the Golani territory, serving as a hiking guide for this youth hostel that I'm volunteering at. It's mid-May, the temperatures are already reaching 102 degrees at the height of the afternoon, and I'm leaving early with 2 international tourists, a British man and a Colombia woman, and we are sweating in silence on our 6-mile hike into the Zevitan waterfalls at the center of the Yehudia Nature Reserve. And this nature reserve is 134 square kilometers. It's the largest reserve in the Golan. And as a nature reserve, it's meant to reserve a specific biosphere, a certain natural conservation, flora, fauna, geological, archeological is a huge factor in the Golan, where they're talking about ancient artifacts or ruined villages that they're trying to reconstruct. So this is a protected area. It's managed, it's got park rangers, so your local national park, try to think about that in this context. And the Golan nature in particular, these reserves balance the geological and archeological interests of Israel. I'll make this journey into the Yehudia Nature Preserve more than a dozen times that summer, but today it's my first time bringing this group in, and unsurprisingly, I misdirect them to a totally different waterfall. And my comrades are pretty, they're like, no, we want to see the Zevitan, it's beautiful, the water is cold. So I'm like, okay, yes, let us go. And we walk the long way around into the formal entrance of Yehudia. So you can not pay an entrance fee if you sneak in through the back, but you have to pay the entrance fee if you go through the front. And so as I'm walking in, we are greeted by one of the park rangers, Moaz, who is originally from Bukata. He drives 30 minutes from his home to the nature reserve, and he greets me in Hebrew, and I can't do it. So I counter in Arabic, and I'm like, B'taki Arabia, because I can do that. And he's like, yes, me too. And now I've made my first Golani Druze friend. And over the coming weeks, I meet Moaz out on the trails over and over. He is walking this terrain every day, and he'll occasionally bring his lunch down to the waterfall, and he takes his shoes off so he can feel the cold water on his feet. And he is deeply content working for the Nature and Parks Authority of Israel because he is connected to the land and to nature. In fact, he's made a career of it. He now serves as a reserve inspector, surveying the various reserves in the Golan and guiding travelers to find the most beautiful places. And he also recruits and mentors new guides for the nature reserve. So on the left, this is just a simple flyer that's asking for seasonal help with the parks as more tourists come during the summer or during the spring when the flowers are blooming. And one such new recruit that Moaz is mentoring is Layla, who works as a guide for the Nature and Parks Authority, as well as her own tourism business. She takes small parties out on excursions in the Golan, specifically around Mesd Shams, showing off statues of Atras Pasha, the wildflowers that bloom around people's staircases, and the fruit that has so long dominated the agroeconomy of the Golan. But to be a tour guide in Israel is no small feat. Layla, a Mesd Shams native, has gone through extensive training to operate a one-woman tourism show. So Israel has a rigorous process for becoming a licensed tour guide. There are 3 colleges known for their School of Tourism, with University of Haifa having the largest, most extensive. And the licensure program is actually developed by the Ministry of Tourism. And the goals of the program are to, quote, provide the guide with knowledge of the land of Israel in the fields of archaeology, history, religions, daily life, flora, fauna, geography, art, architecture, and current events. And this program is for anyone who loves trips that seek to enrich their knowledge of the land of Israel. The only prereqs are a full matriculation certificate, so maybe high school, college credit, knowledge of the English language, and Israeli citizen or resident of Israel holding a permanent resident visa, right? This is how the Golani Druze, even though they don't have Israeli citizenship, are getting into the education system. You have to complete your tour, you have to complete your tour guide course, you have to get a certificate of absence of any criminal record, and you have to have success in these government exams that are in Hebrew. So if you don't speak Hebrew, seeking assistance might be the best thing you can do in order to pass this test. Although you can give tours in multiple languages, the bureaucracy of it all is in Hebrew. And the bureaucracy of licensure is actually pretty interesting because it points to the real unique problems that minorities of Israel have every day. Assumptions about access to education, quality of education, bi and trilingualism, citizenship. These are all baked into the prerequisites of operating your own tourism business or serving as a tour guide for another operation. In some ways, you have to, in order to benefit from the economics of tourism, you have to participate in the colonial state and in some ways concede otherwise forms of resistance to nationalism and colonialism. Previous forms of sovereignty and self-reliance are no longer as impactful. So take, for example, the fruit market of the Golan. Agriculture, and particularly apple and cherry farming, were once the mainstay of a Golan economy. And this has decreased in importance because fewer Syrian households are able to live off the land. Most agricultural production is based off of small holdings of families who are unable to compete with industrialized forms of Israeli farming and increased apple imports, as well as the Syrian market, which after 2013, it previously guaranteed purchases and now no longer does because that market has closed. Many households that were formerly involved exclusively in agriculture are reported to have turned to agro-tourism instead as a complementary source of income. So take, for example, the Orchard Valley Walking Tour. This is offered by El Marsad. This is the Arab Center for Human Rights in the Golan Heights, and it describes in the pamphlet on alternative tourism, at the bottom of Majd al-Shams, there's a beautiful valley of apple and cherry orchards cultivated by local Syrian farmers. The tour will take you through the orchards where you will have the opportunity to meet farmers and pick fruit depending on the season. You will then visit Lake Ram, where our guide will address issues such as illegal exploitation of natural resources in the Golan by Israel and the impact of the occupation on Syrian farmers and the landscape. But even with alternative tourism, the problem of Israeli settlements and increased marketing by the Ministry of Tourism to the Golan is providing other forms of attraction for tourists, but also employment for Syrian Druze. So here are a few examples of itineraries should you ever partake. The Golan Heights day trip from Jerusalem. Rise into the Golan Heights on a full day trip from Jerusalem and take in the scenic landscape of the high mountainous plateau. Visit border hot springs and a Talmudic village. Explore the ruins of a 6th century synagogue and spot ancient Hebrew inscriptions. Take in views from the top of an extinct volcano above the Kenetra Valley. This is Mount Bintel. This is specifically a huge space for war tourism in the Golan. The Golan Heights day trip from Tel Aviv. Spend the day exploring historic Golan Heights on this popular day trip from Tel Aviv. Your route takes you past numerous scenic overlooks, perfect for snapping photos, as well as through the ancient village of Katzrin, the capital of the Golan Heights. I mean, I hope you can hear some of this problematic language that's getting built into these itineraries. But I'll leave you with one last one, which I think you'll find very, very interesting, which is the Go Kedem Golan Heights ATV action and wine tasting tour from Tel Aviv. Visit the Golan Highlands vast landscape and Eli Cohen Park during this full-day guided tour on board your own four-wheeler with 3 meals included. Stop for fresh Israeli breakfast before exploring the Golan Trail to Kalat Nimrod and passing by the Sea of Galilee. Ascend the mountain to the Oz 77 Memorial and look down on the battle arena of the Yom Kippur War. And finish with a Druze culinary experience. I said this last night to someone. I said, do you like Druze food? And they said, what is Druze food? Right? But let me repeat it one more time. Finish with a Druze culinary experience. And this is where the Druze of Tahat and Falk, the Druze of I said that backwards, but of the Druze of Israel, of below, and Falk, above, the Druze of Golan, this is where they intersect, actually, because food and culinary tourism in Israel is a huge revenue source for Druze to get out their own experiences to Jewish Israelis. Food enterprises, where I met Sami in the beginning of my talk, this seems to be the most successful spot to bringing in tourists and having open discussions about life as a minority and a refugee in Israel. And comments online about the Druze food in particular in the Golan. The food was incredible. We ended our day with great food at a Druze village. And this is the catch-22 of tourism in the Golan, which makes life possible and impossible for Druze still living there. So over the last 20 years, villages have seen modernization as part of their acclimatization and their integration into modern Israeli society. So access to healthcare, higher education, economic mobility. Yeah, sure, there's a rolling blackout every now and then, and landmines will slide down into your neighborhood or your yard if it rains too hard. But Druze communities have seen major infrastructural development over the last 20 years. Roads have now built. It's more mobile than ever to get to and from the Golan. Businesses, industry, tourism are now more accessible than ever. And in many ways, this has led to an improved quality of life and well-being for Golani Druze, especially the younger generation, right? I said most everyone's under 52, so this is the only life they've ever known. So in this way, Golani Druze and Israeli Druze are living these paralleled lives of integration both culturally and economically. And this has led to more resources and possibilities than ever. But also like Israeli Druze, Jewish ethno-nationalism and Arab discrimination plagues Israeli society. Discriminatory practices and policies, which, to quote Al-Marsad, it removes the competition and distribute vital resources in an equitable manner. It stunts Syrian sovereignty and life. Israeli settlers lease the land for free, while Druze are denied building permits. Syrian Druze ski instructors pay entrance fees, while their settler counterparts do not. The Nature and Parks Authority confiscate thousands of dunams of land from around Druze villages in order to preserve them for their environmental and historical value, leaving Druze really strapped for urban sprawl. They cannot build the houses they need to build for their growing populations. And moreover, the nation-state law of 2018, claiming Israel as the Jewish homeland and rhetorically deeming Arab Israelis, including Druze, as second-class citizens, reiterates the tension that exists between the Druze minority and the Jewish majority. And I want to suggest that by including Druze of Golan in expressions of discontentment and public protests, by including them and their demand for equal rights and opportunities, that we might actually achieve that. Their place in Israeli geography, economics, and tourism, now citizenship, may shift the weight of current Druze efforts to claim equality. And according to Nissan, his 2011 piece, the Druze would prefer to remain under Israeli rule rather than face uncertainty. So these younger Druze of the Golan are facing a much different Israel and a much different Syria than their fathers and grandfathers. They're more open to external influences. And in a study done on personal well-being, I've sent you sort of the screenshot of that article. On a study done on personal well-being, mental resilience and emotional intelligence in first and second generation Druze in the Golan. Second generation interviewees had no concerns about the occupation and even perceived living under the state of Israel positively as a chance for socio and economic advancement. Modernization and significant economic and social improvement has increased Druze personal well-being and their mental resilience. So I presented you at sort of the 10,000-foot view of tourism in the Golan and how it's impacting the Druze living under occupation. And let me be very, very clear. The Golani Druze are being occupied. Their land is being settled for them by Jewish settlers. Their choices to integrate are not an indictment on their loyalty to their religion, community, ethnicity, or even their Syrian identity. They live under colonial rule where they are economically and socially disadvantaged because they are not Jewish. And as forms of resistance to the occupation wane, Druze of the Golan Heights are reconsidering their intersectionality as undefined Syrian Arab Druze in an attempt to have better lives than their fathers and grandfathers who lived through trauma all only know about conceptually. So I'll leave you with the word of Shams, a young man living in Majlis Shams. He takes a long drag of his cigarette, crosses his legs, and says, "All I want is a normal life. At this point, I don't need to be Syrian or Druze or Israeli. I just want to live in peace. I can either be occupied or killed. Maybe if I have Israeli citizenship, it'll make my life simple. And it's not like you can feel the occupation. You can get used to it." Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pullum. I forgot, when we started this panel, I forgot to mention that we had a second speaker today who unfortunately was unable to join us due to personal circumstances, Dr. Yusril Khaizaran. So that means we have questions for Lindsey. And I want to announce that immediately after the question sessions, we will break for lunch, which is going to be next door. But I will give you more details at the end. We open the floor now for questions. Please go ahead.
Ellen, right? Yeah, please.
So, did you mention that anything about the legality of their refugee status? I'm sorry if I missed that.
So
I mean, I'm asking, I have two questions. One is, do they have refugee status under, definitions under international law in the Golan? Okay, that's number one. And the second one is, so for the Druze that are seeking citizenship, what's going to happen to them regarding their military status, the males at least? Well, actually.
Love that question. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, have they thought about that? What's their attitude? How does that figure into this development?
Yeah,
and I guess the third thing I would just say is, this reminds me of Rhoda Kanana's book, Surrounded. Have you read that?
No.
It's about the phenomena of...
I'm a terrible, keeping up to date with literature, so Surrounded, keep going.
I feel your pain. But that book talks about a phenomena, and I can't remember when it started, of Arab Christians, citizens, Palestinian citizens of Israel, also seeking to enter the military, which they have traditionally been denied or exempted from, depending on how you look at it. And that is an interesting phenomenon too, but it started earlier than this one. So I mean, these issues just really interest me. If you have
that's a great reference. Thank you for that.
answers.
Yeah, I'll start with the first one. Are they still refugee status defined? As far as I know, yes. But what I find interesting about Golani Druze refugees, you're making a face.
No, I'm just going to say that amazes me actually that Israel allows for that status to exist on the Golan when they technically annexed it.
Yeah, this is the international community. So the international community deems the Golan under occupation. The international community irrefutably has said this is occupation. Yeah, but your second question about citizenship and its implications on military service are wild. So as we know, Israeli Druze serve in the military. The Israeli Druze men do right after high school. They'll do their conscripted service. The women do not. And the question on the table for Druze getting citizenship now, as of right now, they've not had to partake in the IDF as part of conscripted service. The question is, will that be an avenue that they want to pursue in terms of more integration, right? As of right now, the answer is no, they don't want to do it. They just want the citizenship and the healthcare and access to education, and they don't want to do military service. But the repercussion of that is what jobs you can get if you don't have the IDF on your resume. Of them, yeah, yeah. See my first book, yes. Yeah, absolutely. So technically, Malik, I did see your hand. Did you want to cut line or do you want to wait? You'll wait, okay. And also, Dima, you had your hand raised. Do you want to cut in line or do you do? Okay. Please, sir.
Please, since you had this research of the Golan Heights, we don't know. Number one, is Israel a democratic country that the United States recognize? And second thing, those Jewish settlements that they went into Golan Heights built, what land, who owned the land before? Is it the Syrian government or the Druze they were living there?
Your first question I will send to my second panelist who's not here. He can answer that. Your question about land ownership, though, so I mentioned before 100,000 Druze fled in 1967. So who owned the land before? So these were Druze homes. if you walk the nature reserve, you'll see remnants of and actually one of the photos that Michael posted yesterday, not posted, he had it on his presentation where you've got these big stones around, like you'll see that in the Golan, and it's hard to figure out when you're just passing by on a hike, if those are just stones out in the wilderness or if those are people's homes. And it's very specific when people will designate it, oh, those are just stones hanging out, or no, that was someone's home that we're like reviving and rebuilding archaeologically. So land ownership was previously Druze and is now being settled by Israel. Sir?
I hope I'm not cutting through the line.
No, Dima, you're they're next. We got
Okay,
it.
thank you. Since your discussion is about Israeli tourism, I read an article whereby the Ministry of Tourism under the right-wing government initiated a policy to make claims that are totally false, meaning, for example, a guide will take some tourists and would say, this is the bridge where Isaiah slept under, or
Right.
this is the cave in the Golans where Ishki lived for so many days, and so. And it's becoming part of the institution to cement the Israeli claim
Exactly.
to not just to the land but to the culture and heritage.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you came across anything of that nature during your research on Israeli tourism and the curricula that is set for people to become tour guides.
Yeah.
Any light, if you can shed some light on this, I would be grateful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I won't speak to the specific courses in terms of, I like how you said the curricula of it. I can't speak to that because I don't know. But there's I guess I'll tell you two examples. This narrative, this like almost religious spin. So this happens in Daliat al-Carmel in the largest Israeli Druze village, where the prophet Elijah, where he soaks the thing with water and then he prays to God and it like goes up in flames. And I really should know my biblical history better than this. I'm so sorry, I'm botching that story. So that happens in the Druze village as a way of being like, this is a religious pilgrimage. Come and see the site of Elijah and the Mount Carmel altar. In the Golan, it's slightly different. They have Nimrod, they have the 6th century synagogue in Katzrin. So they're doing religious pilgrimage adjacent work. But it's mostly military history. This is where the Yom Kippur War, this is where the Assyrian tanks came, and there were like 2 Jewish soldiers at this Mount Bintel post, and they held off the Syrians in the Yom Kippur War. And it's military history, not necessarily the religious history that you'll see inside Israel, where other Druze communities live. Yeah. Dima, I'm ready for you.
When you talk about military history, it reminds me of Melita for the Hezbollah, you know. Maybe they were inspired by the Hezbollah, actually. Well, I have very small questions. I'm wondering whether the Druze are considered, when they get the citizenship, the Israeli citizenship, are they considered as Arabs or as Druze? Because the Druze have a specific status in Israel and are not considered as Arabs like the Muslims and the Christians. So
Right.
I was wondering if they are admitted as, you know, like this, you know, like the Circassians, the Druze, etc.
Right.
So the separate, also secondary citizenship. The second question is how were you able to go through the interviews and the study when actually you were like in a way hiding behind you know, being a tour guide and you know, doing what you're doing. I mean, did they realize that actually you were doing a PhD and study or research? I mean, this is my second. Then the third thing is how come they're younger than 52 years old? I mean, where are the elderly? Were they the ones that left? I mean, left to Syria, and why did they leave behind the young people? I mean, in 67 or in 81. And last, I mean, just to talk about what you talked about is now there's something really interesting going on in Jordan. It's the Israelis trying to say that the Nabateans were a Jewish people that have converted to, well, later on to Islam. So they're actually trying to claim Petra now. So just to, it's interesting because there's this very, well, this is happening now. Thank you.
Yeah, I will say, I can't speak to the ID cards about whether or not they are deemed Arab or Druze, only because I just haven't seen one. That's a simple question I could find the answer to. I just need to text somebody. So TBD, find me after lunch. I will say I was very transparent when I was working in Katsrin, in Meza Shams, in Mount Bintal. Like, I was very transparent that I was there for research, that I was there as an advocate for the Syrian Druze in the Golan. The trickiest part about doing what I called in my dissertation volunteer ethnography is you balance being the person someone needs you to be at a hostel, on a hike, with your sort of second agenda, and really the time constraints that you have to be authentic to both of those people was the hardest part, because yes, the Golan is more accessible now, but I was taking a bus every Tuesday, Thursday, Sunday, up to the mountain, riding it back down and making it in time for a shift, sometimes running from Mount Bintal down to a bus stop and, you know, buying a pack of goat cheese and then running back to the hostel. So I can't emphasize enough the transparency that has to be done in a space like that, especially from a community who has historically been undermined by the Israeli government. I have way too much respect for the people who live there to pretend I'm not there for my own reasons, which is to tell their story. Yeah, your question, where are the elders? So we have a population burst, or an increase. So it's not that they're not there. And in fact, their voice is still, they're still leaders of their community. They're actually still promoting Syrian loyalty, Syrian heritage, protesting Israeli policies. The problem is, like, raise your hand if you're a millennial in this room. Yeah, raise your hand if you're Gen Z. Yeah, exactly. So the problem isn't that they're not there, it's that more new generations are coming up in a land of digital native, like, where internet access, where phone access, where communication access is unprecedented. Yeah, so it, because of this 67. Yeah, yeah, that's very much a historical, like, that land was Syrians. We're in peace talks with Syria, so that's where that language came from. Yeah. All right, you've been waiting patiently, friend, please.
And that will be, excuse me for interruption, that will be our last question for today.
Thank you so much.
لا okay, الحق معك. Okay, then I will take two. We're bargaining here too.
Thank you, Doctor, for your
Yeah.
insightful presentation.
Wait,
Oh,
let us have our friend. He's already at the mic.
I will proudly give my turn to Malik. Please. Go ahead. I'll talk after you. Go ahead.
Is this how The Bachelor feels?
Yalla. So quickly, I just want to ask you about the Syrian civil war and differences of opinion. Are there any differences of opinion, generations, in terms of how they related to the Thawra and later war in Syria? So, because I think there's are the people who, my question really is, does the openness to Israel fall alongside a similar axis in relationship to Syria, where the people who want to integrate into Israel are more against the Assad regime and then the older generation, or are there people who are kind of against both, or what has been the stance of people in the Golan vis-a-vis the revolution and the war?
Yeah.
And does this map into a generational difference? And how does it map onto other questions of nationalism or ideology? If it does, maybe it doesn't.
Yeah, and please go ahead and ask your question as well.
So my question is, when was your last trip to Golan Heights?
I'm gonna just, yes, let me marry those two questions, because because I don't have an answer for Malik, the answer is because I haven't been back in 6 years.
So was it before or after April 5th, 2017?
It was after.
Okay, so on April 5th, 2017, the Knesset passed something called the Kamenetz Law, which was a turning point in the Israeli politics and existential for the Orthodox Israeli Druze, even, because it declared that, hey, even if you're Israeli Druze, you are not Israelis.
Right.
You're second grade.
Right.
And this is creating a debate right now even. You know, when this law turns to be implemented in a way or another,
Right.
after having to pay like 15 million shekels for so-called illegal houses that you mentioned anyway.
Right.
This is a question. My question to you, based on what you saw, could the Golan Heights work as a state in a federal Israel? Thank you.
Yeah, I love that question. Yeah, so I'll start with Malik. Malik, I don't know. And only because I didn't ask. At the time, I was interested in cultural production. I was interested in the economics of where people were working. And the Syrian civil war was still very much like on the forefront of people's minds, but it was kind of like de facto in the background all the time. That would have been a great question to ask and one I should ask going forward. The basic law that I think is what you're referencing from 2017 that spawned this whole, there's a movement done by Israeli Druze, Gedirmi herself was here, the Shevion Ze Basisi is equality is basic, which downgraded every Arab Israeli to a second-class position, one that was maybe informal before, but was definitely legalized after. If we're thinking about the same law now that I say it out loud. But to your question, could the Golan act as a state in the federal context? I don't know, but I would be very interested to see what that might look like in terms of their political influence, because they definitely have political influence that just has yet to be formalized in the Israeli government. But I'm sure we will find out for ourselves in the 2020s. I yield my time.
Oh, no, I have one more question, and then let's answer it
Oh,
briefly.
please, yes.
So,
Good morning. I would like to have a comment, actually. It's not a question. Let's learn from history. The South Africa, they jailed Nelson Mandela for so many years. At the end, they lost the country. So basically, that's how history works itself. As long as the Israelis are discriminating among themselves,
Right.
there was 50,000 blood bags or blood pounds from the Falasha. They sent it to trash. Why? Because they're not Israelis in the way they think,
Right.
through the eyes of the Western Israeli. So the Eastern Israeli is different than the Western one. As long as they have this kind of a mentality that we are the chosen people, they will be chosen to be ousted in no time.